Good evening and welcome. My name's Andrew Copson. I'm Chief Executive of Humanists UK, and this is the latest in our occasional series of events from Humanists UK that we've been holding over the pandemic and now beyond online, which have been great ways of getting discussion going, bringing speakers together that we might not normally be able to bring together, and reaching audiences that we haven't always been able to reach, as well as widening participation in our events. So this evening, we'll be discussing the nature of morality. Not only welcome to all of you, but congratulations if you've resisted the allures of the incipient summer outside and the heat that's calling you. You've not only turned up here to be welcomed, you've done the right thing, the morally right thing, I can assure you, by choosing to be at this event. I'd also like to specially welcome Birmingham Humanists, our local affiliated group in Birmingham, who are also having an event in person this evening to watch along this video event and follow a discussion afterwards. I think that's an excellent idea and a way of bringing these events to even wider audiences and helping to build that sense of community in our local humanist groups that we do want to build. Tonight, we're discussing a question that has been, and undoubtedly, even if we solve it here this evening, will continue to be a source of ongoing debate, discussion by philosophers, scientists, and general public for thousands of years and continues to this day. What is morality? Why do we call it that? What's it for? Where does it come from? And what does it consist of? We know, of course, as good humanists, that across history and in every part of the world, versions of the same golden rule have underpinned what different societies have seen as moral behavior: to treat other people in the way that you would like to be treated, to value other people in the way that you'd value yourself. But is it as simple as that? Where does that rule come from? Is it really a hard and fast rule? And can a society's approach to morality, ethics, and cooperation tell us anything about the fundamental nature of morality itself? Where societies differ in their understanding of what's right and wrong, is there any way to say which approach is better? And if we understand our moral values as something that evolved with humanity, is it reasonable to see those values as simply the most advantageous ways of behaving? And especially today, in increasingly global neighborhood, could we have evolved a completely different set of morals? And what would that mean for the question of what the right thing is? Well, those questions and many others are what we'll be delving into this evening. I'm joined tonight by three very excellent speakers, each of whom will have, I expect, a slightly different take on our topic. I'll give each of them a longer introduction when they speak, but before then, I'll just say in brief, I'm delighted to be joined today by our 2021 Darwin Day lecturer, Dr. Oliver Scott Curry, our 2021 Voltaire lecturer, Professor Nichola Raihani, and Humanist UK patron and co-founder of the Humanist Philosophers Group, Professor Richard Norman. We'll start off then straight away by introducing Dr. Oliver Scott Curry, whose academic research investigates the nature, content, and structure of human morality and touched on all the questions that we've outlined in the blurb for this event. He employs a range of techniques to reach the answers, the provisional answers that he reaches. I won't say any more than that because he'll likely tell us all about it. But in addition to his research, he's taught courses on evolution and human behavior, covering evolutionary theory, animal behavior, evolutionary psychology and cross-cultural psychology, statistics and research methods. And he's currently the research director for Kind Lab at kindness.org. Very worth a follow on all your social media platforms for a daily boost of interest. He's a research affiliate at the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography at the University of Oxford and a research associate at the Centre for Philosophy of Natural and Social Science at the London School of Economics. Oliver, give us your take, set out your stall on this timeless question.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you all. My name is Oliver Scott Curry. I've been working on the nature of morality for years, for decades, it seems. And I've argued in my work that there's nothing mysterious or magical about morality. It's merely a collection of cooperative rules that help us get along, work together, keep the peace, and promote the common good. There's many different types of cooperation in game theories. There's the mathematics of cooperation. There's kin selection, there's mutualism, there's reciprocity, there's conflict resolution. And those different types of cooperation explain why there's different types of morality, why we have a variety of different moral rules, different moral values, including love, loyalty, reciprocity, heroism, deference, fairness, and respect for property. So these rules seem to be evolutionarily ancient. We can find simpler examples of them in other species. They seem to have a distinct genetic basis in humans. These rules or these proclivities emerge early in infancy in little kids, and we find these same 7 rules all around. We found examples of them all around the world. So it's not really merely a Western view of morality. It seems to be these aspects of morality seems to be universal. It seems that everyone everywhere agrees that cooperation is the right thing to do, and they agree that these are some of the ways to do it. So we can study morality like we study any other part of the natural or social world. It's just another part of our psychology, of our behavior. We can study it like a vision or our taste buds or anything else. And it follows from this scientific account of morality that given that morality is this collection of cooperative rules, then doing the right thing just means acting in accordance with those rules. It just means if you want to be good, then you ought to cooperate. And as such, moral questions are simply empirical questions as to what's the most cooperative move to make. And they have empirical answers. Some behaviors really do promote cooperation better than others. So the sooner we realize I don't want to say ordinary, as long as we realize the natural, grounded, everyday nature of morality, not only can we hopefully see our way through to the right answers more often, having sort of cleared out the mist, we can also scrutinize the rules, the current rules that we have, and try and invent new and better cooperative rules that help us all get along even better and make for a kinder world. Thank you very much.
Oliver, thank you, Oliver. Oliver, you mentioned there the 7 rules, and I wonder if you might say just a little bit more before we move on to the next speaker, of what those 7 rules you're talking about are and how you arrived at them in your work. Well,
so lots of people argue that morality is about cooperation. And then if you just go to the mathematics of cooperation, you find that cooperation is not just one thing. In game theory, there's many games, and these are kind of slogans that pack a lot in. But the 7 rules are: love your family, be loyal to your group, return favors, be brave, defer to your superiors, divide resources fairly, and respect property. There might be more rules than this, but these are, and as we discover more about the mathematics of cooperation, we might discover more stable cooperative rules. But at least those seem to be, like I said, deeply rooted and spread far and wide around the world.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Oliver. Right, we come next to Professor Nichola Raihani, who, as I mentioned, gave our Voltaire lecture last year. She's a Royal Society University Research Fellow and Professor in Evolution and Behaviour at University College London, and her group's research focuses on the evolution of social behaviour in humans and non-human species, widely published in all the respectable scientific journals, and the winner of the 2018 Philip Levehume Prize in Psychology for her research achievements. She was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Biology in 2018 and is the author of the excellent book that can't be recommended highly enough, The Social Instinct: How Cooperation Shaped the World, which came out by Penguin last year. Following on from that book and before, she's appeared on several podcasts and radio shows. So if you're unsatisfied with the small offering of Nichola Raihani tonight, there are ample opportunities to go out and hear her thought more in all of those different places, from Radio 4's Hacking the Unconscious and Thought Cages to the RSA's Bridges to the Future. And she's also very active on social media, so you can follow her just like you can follow Oliver there. But you don't need to do that quite just yet because you've got the advantage of her real presence. Nichola, do you want to set out for us your perspective on this question?
Hi, thanks, Andrew. Thanks for the intro and for mentioning the book. Yeah, so I'm Nichola Raihani, and I'm a professor of evolution and behaviour at UCL. And I'm basically interested in the question of why individuals cooperate, why individuals ever pay costs to help others. And I think this topic is relevant to morality because situations of cooperation often involve conflict, because cooperation frequently entails sacrificing something, sacrificing your immediate self-interest to help others or to promote the collective good. And I think it's how we behave in those situations of conflict, and also how we judge others in those situations of conflict for their behavior, that form the basis of morality and moral judgment. So I agree with a lot of what Oliver has said about morality, but I think some of the areas where perhaps we might differ on how we view morality is that while I agree with Oliver that there are these universal moral values, if you like, I think one of the things that's really interesting about our species is that we actually don't always agree on what we think is the morally right thing to do. And we know that that can vary quite a bit depending on the context, across societies. And it seems to be influenced by things that shouldn't really make a difference. So to give you just one example, we might think of helping other individuals or being generous as being something that's morally good and morally virtuous. But, you know, lots of research, including work that I've done, has also shown that sometimes people who do good things are viewed with suspicion and contempt, and that actually helping others is not seen as being morally good. And there are lots of reasons why that might be. For example, if we suspect that the altruistic person has nefarious or self-interested motives, if you're helping one individual but neglecting to help another category of individual, all these kinds of contextual factors can really impinge on the moral judgments we make. And I think that's what makes the topic so fascinating. I'm going to leave it there because I think there's going to be lots of really interesting questions that come from the audience, and I think it would be nice to focus on those. But yeah, good to be here, and thanks for the intro.
Just before we do leave it then, Nichola, why don't you say something just very quickly about the extension of your work into the world of animals other than humans, other animals, and what light that throws back on these questions in the human domain?
Sure. So I work on a very broad canvas. So I'm very broadly interested in this question of how helping behavior evolves in nature. And my view is that humans are basically just another animal on this planet, and that we have quite a lot in common with other species that cooperate as well. So one species that I've worked on quite a bit is called the cleaner fish, and they live throughout the Indo-Pacific, and they help other species, other fish that live on the coral reefs that the cleaner fish inhabits, by providing a cleaning service that involves the removal of ectoparasites from the surface of the client's skin. So this is a really nice model system for understanding how cooperation can evolve among individuals that aren't related to each other and in fact are complete strangers. And it has in some ways lots in common with the kinds of cooperation that we see in our own societies as well. And what we know in the cleaner fish system is that even though this looks like it should be a harmonious interaction, there's actually a conflict here between the cleaners and the clients, because what the cleaners prefer to eat, if they're given the chance, is the client's living tissues. And so they find themselves in one of these situations of conflict that I just spoke about, where one individual is maybe tempted to do something self-interested, to cheat, to bite or eat living tissue. And you have another individual, the client, who will be harmed by that cheating behavior. And what we see in systems like the cleaner fish system and in lots of non-human species is that often these kinds of situations of conflict can be resolved and cooperation can be produced, even though, as far as we know, none of these non-human species really have any concept of morality per se, or any kind of value-based judgment system for why it's good to cooperate and why you ought to behave in this way. And so it really is only humans that have this concept of morality, and thinking about why that is the case is also a really interesting, and I would say actually to some extent an unanswered question as to why, clearly we can get cooperation without morality. So why do we have it? Why do humans have it? Why do we need it? Why do we use it? I think is a very interesting question that I don't have a great answer for, but I don't think we necessarily have the answers to those kinds of questions yet.
Thank you so much. Now, we come on to Richard Norman, who taught philosophy at the University of Kent for many years, working mainly in the areas of moral and political philosophy, including both theoretical and practical ethics, and is now Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy. His many books, many of which you will have read if you're devoted humanists logging in this evening, but if you haven't, then please do go out there because they're all well worth devouring. The Moral Philosophers, Free and Equal, Ethics, Killing and War, a really interesting book on broader philosophical perspectives on those questions, and his book for Routledge on humanism, which is really the best book by a working philosopher on the humanist approach to life. He's a very active member of the humanist movement, helped to found the Humanist Philosophers Group, as well as the Humanist Peace Forum, Humanists for a Better World, and Humanist Climate Action, and has participated in very many Humanist UK events and conferences, as well as giving the keynote address at the World Humanist Congress in Oslo in 2011, which was really extremely stimulating address on killing the innocent, humanism and the just war tradition. So here this evening, though, he's speaking more generally than about war and peace on questions of wider morality, and I'll let him get right to it. Richard.
Thanks so much, Andrew. I'd like to offer a couple of points, if I may, just which hopefully may spark off some further discussion. I'm conscious of the danger of setting up a bit of a demarcation dispute here between the philosophers and the scientists, but I don't want to do this because I think there's a direct continuity between the work that Nichola and Oliver do and the philosophical tradition which humanism itself draws on so richly. Aristotle famously said humans are social animals, more so than any bee or any gregarious animal. And Aristotle, in a similar sort of way to our other speakers here, saw the social nature of human beings as what makes us ethical animals. Aristotle was, of course, a philosopher, but he was also a practicing biologist. His biological works are full of observations about different behavior of different species as well as humans. And I think Aristotle would have loved Nichola's and Oliver's work, which adds hugely to the evidence for the fact that we are social animals, that our lives are embedded in social relationships, and that that's the basis of our moral capacities. Now, there's one obvious difference between Aristotle and modern scientists, which is, of course, that Aristotle's biology was not located within an evolutionary perspective. So let me put this question: what does that evolutionary perspective add? Well, in one sense, very little. I mean, all the facts about our social nature still remain. They were very clear to Aristotle, as they are now. But what the crucial difference that the evolutionary perspective makes, I think, is, as Oliver put it just now, to show that there's nothing mysterious about the social and therefore the moral nature of human beings. We don't need a divine creator to explain why human beings are as they are. We don't need to suppose that our moral conscience is somehow heaven sent. Morality is an entirely natural phenomenon, as it was indeed for Aristotle, but evolutionary theory explains how that comes to be the case. Here's a second question that I want just quickly to pose before we move on then. Is there a science of morality? Well, in one sense, of course there is. It's what Nichola and Oliver do. And it's that empirical work, that empirical scientific work is highly relevant to our understanding of morality. But I also want to say that ethics is not itself a science. I want to say, we may disagree on this, but I want to say science can't itself tell us what is right. The science can't tell us how to live. Why not? Well, consider this, for example. Science can explain how we come to be social beings, but science can also explain deep-rooted facts about human beings. There's an evolutionary explanation for their origins, which are morally problematic. It's a fact about us, for example, that we tend to act for the short term. We respond quickly to immediate stimuli. We act impulsively. We lose our temper and get angry. Science can explain why those are features of human beings. Clearly, those are traits that serve evolutionary purposes. for responding to immediate danger without having to stop and contemplate what to do. And sometimes we need to act in those ways, but sometimes also, of course, acting impulsively, losing our temper or whatever, or being short-termist, it stands in the way of doing the right thing. And the fact that we can give an evolutionary scientific explanation of them doesn't make them right. Consider also this. It's a very central theme of Nichola's book that, as she beautifully puts it, cooperation has victims. Cooperation between members of one group can very easily happen at the expense of other groups. Notoriously, a group will ally against outsiders, and the group itself will be strengthened by its enmity to outsiders. Oliver just referred to his own taxonomy of 7 different kinds of cooperation and the different kinds of moral rules that they bring with them. But of course, they may conflict with one another. Our family loyalties, for example, may come into conflict with our obligations to the wider community. Our standing by our friends, or even favouring our friends, may come up against the requirement of fairness, both rooted in cooperation, but in conflict with one another. Evolutionary theory can explain how it is that group cooperation can also involve hostility to the external group, how our internal loyalties are strengthened by the hostility to an external enemy, the phenomenon of bonding by exclusion. And of course, that can often have terrible consequences, leading to conflict and war, as we sadly see so much. But the fact that these things can be scientifically explained and have evolutionary roots and are deep features of human behavior doesn't make them right. So I want to agree, our social nature is the basis of our moral capacities, but it also provides the explanation for morally bad actions. It generates conflicts, and science can explain these things, but it can't tell us what is right in those situations. It can't resolve the conflicts. It can't tell us what to do. For that, we need ethical thinking.
Thanks very much, Richard. Now, we've got the questions absolutely flooding in, which is excellent. We're up to 15 in the question box. If you are erroneously posting your questions in the chat box, please copy them over into the Q&A box. I don't know what it looks like on your screens, because I expect you've got a different looking screen from the one that we've got, but it probably does say Q&A on it. So that's where you should put your questions. But before we come to those, let me see if there's any of our 3 speakers who want to respond to any of the other. Oliver, let's start with you. Is there anything you want to say? Obviously, some of the points that Nichola raised, the question of how context is important, perhaps more important than your initial remarks, she suggested might seem to consider. And Richard has now raised the question of conflict. When these principles conflict, how do you make decisions between the two? So do you want to say something about context and conflict in relation to your own earlier?
Yes. So yeah, I mean, I basically agree, and it's a prediction of this cooperative account of morality that that will happen. So I tend to think of morality as a bit like a graphic equalizer. We've all got the same knobs, but they get twiddled in different ways. And the theory would suggest they are calibrated in different ways during a person's upbringing in response to the kind of social world they live in, the cooperative opportunities they face. So you would expect there to be predictable variation in how these different moral values are prioritized, and roughly speaking, that's what we see. It's also a prediction that precisely because there's a plurality of morals, because of that, you would predict that they will come into conflict, and so you predict that people will have to choose between them, that there will be dilemmas, and in fact, you can use 7 or however many you start with. You can use that as a kind of bingo sheet to predict what kinds of morals what kind of dilemmas will arise. Like, yes, sometimes you have to choose between looking after your family or being the hero. Sometimes you have to choose between group loyalty or respecting someone's property, and so on. So yeah, I mean, I agree, and it sort of follows from the theory rather than being an alternative to it. And I'll stop there, but I hope we get back to the science versus ethics thing later on. I'll stop for now.
I'm sure we will. Nichola, perhaps in relation to what Richard said in particular, this in-group, out-group question, which also has come up in the chat as well, with, oh gosh, there's so many questions, I can't find it now. But Adrian Widdowson asked in the chat about the biggest challenge of moving from, is a big challenge in morality moving from an in-group to universal morality. And that is slightly related to the point, the question that Richard brought up as well in his point about, it's another point about complexity really, but it's also about groups.
Yeah, I love the question actually, and it sort of it has some bearing on what Oliver was talking about just now as well. So this idea that favouring your in-group, and then expanding that moral circle outwards towards favouring people that aren't necessarily your kin, your friends and family, but people who you maybe don't even know, people who aren't even born yet, non-human species. That concept is called the scope of moral regard. And it's something that we can measure empirically, like the extent to which people feel that they have a moral obligation to everybody on the earth, or every living thing on the earth, versus feeling that their moral obligations fall in a much tighter circle, and that they're they face more moral obligations to help their family and their close social network, their close friends. And I think that scope, so there's two things about that scope of moral regard. One thing is that has steadily expanded over the course of human history. And so for many people, that kind of moral expansiveness, or that willingness to kind of draw that big circle around yourself and say that my moral obligation extends to basically everything that's alive on the planet today, and maybe even entities that haven't been born yet, that tendency has increased over history. But there's also another really important thing about that scope of moral regard, which is that not everybody agrees about where we ought to draw those boundaries around ourselves and what size that moral circle ought to be. And some of the biggest disagreements we have as a species actually concern where we draw those fault lines and where we think our scope of moral regard ought to be. So things like parochialism or nationalism or nepotism are all kinds of moral values that place a greater emphasis on helping kin, close network, contacts, and keeping morality bounded within a relatively small social circle. Whereas there are alternative worldviews that say that we should adopt more universalistic perspectives, and that our morality shouldn't be bounded within a tight circle like that, but should be extended to include people that are not our nearest and dearest, essentially. And I think that it's really important when we're discussing these scope of moral regard questions that we resist imbuing them with a value judgment, because I imagine most of the people that are listening to this are based in a Western democracy, and a hallmark of Western democracy is that it tends to be a rather universalist society, where we tend to endorse these moral values that are more expansive and that include more people within those circles. But that scope of moral regard varies quite a bit across different societies. And it also varies within the societies that we live in as well, and for good reasons. So we can draw links to things like material security, which is how able you are to meet your basic needs, and how reliant you are on a tight social circle, that can help us to explain why people draw these tight social circles, or whether they're more likely to be able to have the luxury of a more expansive scope of moral regard. And so I think that it's a very interesting question why this concept of trade-offs, I sense, will come up again and again, because as Oliver pointed out, and as Richard pointed out as well, often helping at one level or helping one individual will entail not helping, or maybe even harming other individuals. And so the fault lines of how we judge the morality of that helping behavior, I think, are really, really interesting to tease out, and to realize that actually we do vary quite a bit in how we judge those, how people solve those trade-offs, we judge that quite differently depending on where we live and who we are and the extent to which we have material security.
Richard, do you want to say anything about that? Because it seems that Nichola there is moving into the sort of territory that you expressed as being necessary when you wanted to start to make these sorts of more complicated judgments.
Yeah, I would like to say a bit about that, actually. I mean, I think the first thing to be said is, as it were, you can't go, ethically speaking, you can't go straight to an abstract universalism. There's a tendency within certain ethical theories, utilitarianism, Kantianism, for example, to say, well, we have the same obligations to every other human being. Moral laws are universal. What's right and about what we've just been saying and what's central to the work that Nichola and Oliver both do is that actually our capacity to respond to other human beings is rooted in those close relationships that we have initially with those who are closest to us, our friends, our family, and so on. And the notion of the expanding circle is just right, I think, that our moral awareness of our responsibilities to wider circles has to build on those more intimate relationships. It can't just replace them. But then, as we just said, then the question is, well, how does the circle expand? Nichola said it's something it's been a tendency over history, and I guess that's in part just a result of the obvious facts of globalization over centuries, that people see other human beings no longer as some just totally weird other human beings. There's far more interaction between human beings as societies expand from the local to the national to the global. So people just come into contact with one another more. But of course, that doesn't guarantee that then people take all other moral human beings seriously and recognize their obligations to others. One important phenomenon here, I think, which is useful for bearing in mind, one important contribution that's made not just by science, is by also a lot of creative literature that makes us aware of the experiences and the standpoints and the needs of human beings very different from ourselves. So I think creative writing, novels, plays, literature of all kinds, can play an important role, which importantly complements that of the science. It's a way of stimulating our imagination as well as just our empirical awareness. It's a way really of bringing into play the golden rule that you referred to at the beginning. The point of the golden rule is think about what it's like for other people, as kids are famously told to say, put yourself in other people's shoes. Creative literature, creative writing of all kinds can do that, and also, of course, biographies, testimonies, and so forth. And that's an important dimension of our moral thinking and our moral awareness, I think. And it's important to see that the role that plays alongside the science that makes us aware of the nature of these social relationships and forms of cooperation.
Thanks. Now, unless Oliver or Nichola want to say something in connection with anything that we've heard so far, I thought we might start to give some more attention to individual questions that are in the Q&A, because there are many of them that are stimulating, and there are so many of them. But is there anything that Oliver or Nichola want to say other than to get stuck into those questions? Because I'm not trying to impede or inhibit you if you do, and Oliver is demuted, so I think he probably does, and so is Nichola. Okay.
Oh no, I was just going to say it's fine to go with the questions, because I think some of the nuance of this kind of discussion about moral expansiveness will come out in the answers to. I've seen some of the questions are on this theme, and I think some of the nuance of that will come out. But yeah.
Well, unlike Nichola,
go on. Go ahead.
I just want to bring up one point, because I think it might forestall some of the questions, and picking up on what Richard said. So it doesn't. Yes, it's true that evolution or science can explain why we're good and why we're bad. Therefore, it doesn't. That's true, but that's not the point. The point is that science also explains the difference between the two, the difference between good and bad. And the conjecture is that the difference between good and bad is essentially being cooperative or uncooperative. So that's a bit of a sort of, it's fascinating to think about where morality came from, and is it nature or nurture, and inevitably a bit of both. But that's a separate issue. The claim is that we can now make conjectures about where the fault line is between good and bad, and we're conjecturing that it's cooperation, and it's the criterion that matters, not the explanation of the behaviors.
But don't you think that so like whenever someone says cooperation is good, I always have a story in my mind, which is that a story I read about in the newspaper a couple of years ago, and it concerned Uber drivers who would arrive at Reagan National Airport and wait for everyone to come off their plane before they then turned off the app that indicated their availability, and then they waited. So at that point, people are looking for an Uber on their thing and there's no availability. So the surge pricing kicks in. And then at that point, the Uber drivers would turn their app back on and take people who will pay a bit more to be journeyed home, right? So that's a story of cooperation, right? Like the Uber drivers are cooperating. They risk missing out on a fare altogether if they switch off their app for too long, and they're cooperating to generate this public good for them, or I suppose it's their common good, their privately held common good, if there is
exactly,
to generate surge pricing. So there's cooperation, but there are victims too, right? So I'm not convinced, unless I'm misunderstanding what you've said, that really there is a really distinct fault line that we can draw where we can say cooperation is good and competition is bad, because and I know you agree with this, cooperation is basically a means to compete, right? And it always pretty much has victims. Like that is how cooperation evolves in the end, because it allows entities to improve their position in the world, and that improvement is a relative concept.
It's Richard's turn, but I'm being fair, so it's Richard's turn, but I would want to say things.
Wait, there's a rule of fairness in play here, yeah.
Do you want to say anything?
Can I just chip in, and then maybe Oliver want to come back
to
both of those points? Let me put this to Oliver. I mean, there's a classic figure in the philosophical tradition who's the extreme egoist, Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, for example, who says, sod cooperation. Why should I cooperate? I don't give a fig for anybody else, just myself. If you say to him, and it usually is a him, but science has shown that it's cooperation that's good and conflict that's bad, and that's the criterion of what's right and wrong. Well, then Thrasymachus will probably just say, well, sod science. I'm just going to get on with my life. I'm going to feather my own nest. Forget it.
Yeah.
Does the science have anything to say to that position? Clearly it has something, but does it answer that position?
Well, yeah, but I mean, if Thrasymachus said, screw you lot, I'm going to do what I want, we would call him a criminal. He'd be acting immorally. He'd be a psychopath, and we'd all gang up and put him in prison. That's exactly the criteria we'd use to determine whether someone, in that case, whether Thrasymachus was behaving badly.
Yeah. And he'd say, and I'm going to make sure I get away with it, and I'll pretend. Yeah,
but that's exactly the world we find ourselves in. Cooperation is a winning strategy for most people most of the time, and we use that criteria to determine who's at fault, and we try to penalize those people to bring them back into line. We're not always successful, but that's exactly that is the world we have.
That's what we do. Yes, it's a fact that that's what we do. But I mean, it's the is-ought question, isn't it? That's what we do. That's what we regard as morality. But ought we to? Well,
you can't say what ought there be, because you'll disappear in a puff of smoke. But just to go from Thrasymachus to back to Nichola for a moment, it's exactly the same thing. So you can have honor amongst thieves. You can have robbers can cooperate to rob a bank. But the reason why we say robbers are bad, even if they're really loyal and helpful to one another, is because we take into account the interests of all the people affected by their actions. And we recognize that sort of local cooperative equilibria, local cooperative schemes can have globally uncooperative effects. And in your example, the Uber drivers were cooperating in order to, I don't know what you want to call it, sort of cheat the public. And precisely for that reason, we say, that falls over the line. They are naughty cab drivers.
That it only falls out over the line if your perspective is a disinterested individual. And I think that you could totally make the other argument that if you're one of the Uber drivers and there's one of them who's like, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to leave my app on and I'm going to take the first passenger that comes, they might view that as being immoral because they are trying to achieve this collective goal of price surge. I can't remember what surge pricing, sorry. And that this person is defecting on that particular local public good that they are trying to generate. And so I think it's like really context specific, like what we actually view as being the right thing to do. Like there's a really nice quote that I came across when I was writing my book, which goes something like, you can't trust someone who only helps their friends. And then, but the reciprocal quote is, oh, but you can't trust someone who never helps their friends. And it's like, it's sort of where you stand kind of affects how you view the morality of these different situations of conflict, I think.
Where are you standing in that sense, Oliver?
I'm standing in the rain waiting for a cab, it sounds like.
It's going to cost you a lot.
I mean, that is obviously what happens. People have conflicting loyalties. Should I stick with should I, be loyal to my other thieves, or shall I, that's the prisoner's dilemma, right? Should I squeal and, tell tales to the police? So that's exactly what happens. I don't think it's a question of whether you're disinterested or not, because what I'm saying is if you were to take into account the interests of everybody affected, you'd come to you'd see that was sort of globally uncooperative. And if you want to explain why do some people sort of restrict their gaze just to their little in-group, we can explain why, because there's a huge incentive to do so. But it doesn't change the overall conclusion. We can explain why people do bad things or why people would come to conveniently self-serving judgments, but that's different from taking into account the interests of everyone involved.
We are actually now moving, as you all suggested, we might to have addressed many of the questions that are in the box, suggesting that this is obviously one of the most interesting topics in a wider question. But we also have an interesting question in the chat that has come up 2 or 3 times about changes in what we see as moral over time. And I think that that's worth coming to now, trying not to see that question solely through the prism of this other question we've just been discussing of whether or not cooperation is the totality of morality or not. One example of a question in this area in the box says, what is seen as moral behavior changes over time, e.g., and there's sort of traditional examples of slavery and homosexual behavior. Some of our moral behavior today will probably be seen as immoral by future generations. How can we account for this? How do we account for this? If there are or should be these common standards and rules that some of you at least have talked about. Who wants to have a look at this, have a first pop at this change over time question, which is the one thing that doesn't change this question, I think, over the centuries. Richard.
Well, can I have a go? I mean, it's partly the expanding circle question, isn't it? I mean, morality has changed over time because people have become more aware of the other, of people different from themselves. So changes in attitudes to slavery, into racism and so forth are partly just a growing awareness of what one has in common with other human beings, and that's crucially important. I have to say also an important dimension of this, important to mention in this event, is the influence of religion. And I suspect that an awareness of that's part of the answer, maybe part of what lies behind the question, because historically, obviously, morality and religious institutions have gone hand in hand. And I think there's no denying it without wanting to be sort of crudely dismissive of the religious, which would be crazy. The fact is that when moral principles become enshrined as the rules encapsulated in a religion, that always has a conservative effect, because if the moral rules are seen as having some extra-human origin, having their source in some divine authority, then of course you don't question them. I mean, religious people do when they come to see and come to recognize that actually, what's said in Leviticus or whatever is the writings of a Hebrew scribe a several centuries ago, not the direct deliverance from the Almighty. But I think there's no doubt that in part moral changes reflect changes in people's attitudes to religion, the fact that increasing number of people don't take their moral awareness from a religious background, and I think that's an important dimension to it, which we need to take into account.
Nichola or Oliver, on this question of change over time, actually, it's interesting you mentioned that this is mostly tied to that expanding circle, because the questioner has just got back in touch in the box and said that the example he was thinking of a behaviour that now might be seen as immoral in future was the keeping of pets.
Right.
They can't agree with. But I can easily see. I think that maybe the eating of animals, that's someone.
Yes, right. Eating them.
The control of animals, the control of other animals by human beings might in the future be seen, whatever purpose. I think it is possible to have a pet in a moral way.
I think you're okay, Andrew. I think
you're way. But that's an example that the questioner had in his mind when he was asking the question, apparently. So your answer definitely speaks to that, Nichola.
I think, again, just like Richard said, I think this is basically this question about the expanding moral circle and under what circumstances does it expand and contract. And I think one quite interesting hypothesis for that that's been made by a guy called Joe Henrich, who some people here might be familiar with. He's written a few books, and Dan Hrishka, is that basically an expanding moral circle is linked to having what we call material security. So material security is basically your ability to meet your basic needs. It's your assurance that if you need food, you'll be able to get it. If you need help, you need looking after. If you're ill, you'll somehow be looked after. You'll be safe from harm. You'll have shelter. Like all these things kind of constitute material security. And one thing that's quite interesting is that when we look around the world, we see that often the kind of moral norms, if you like, or the moral obligations that people endorse seem to be loosely related to this conception of material security. So you tend to see people who have lower material security than others tend to endorse moral principles that emphasize help is kept within a small social circle, because actually those people rely on that small social circle a lot more to be able to make a living and to survive than people who have the benefit of increased material security, where they can afford to take risks and they can afford to consider the fortunes and the well-being of individuals that are outside that small social circle. And I think that one thing that's quite instructive at showing us that it's not just that we're not only marching towards a more expansive moral circle, is what happened during COVID, which was when the material security of more or less everyone on the planet was sort of underwent this extrinsic shock, where suddenly, would you be able to get the pasta at the supermarket? Could you get the toilet roll? Might you be ill at home and not be able to get healthcare because the health system was overwhelmed? And so people who ordinarily experience quite high material security suddenly underwent this collective shock where that was reduced. And what we saw in the wake of that shock in the very early days of the COVID pandemic was a resurgence of that very local cooperation. So we saw a resurgence of things like neighbourhood mutual support groups and the emphasis on keeping your immediate neighbourhood safe, and not actually that much concern for anyone outside that local neighbourhood, actually. I mean, people would still go to the supermarket and panic buy all the toilet roll, but they would, happily come back and then share that around with people on the street, on the street, right? So I think that this idea that we're marching towards increasingly expansive moral circles, even though there has been that historical trend, we can see how easily it can just also go in the other direction if society or if individuals experience these shocks to material security, that we can actually have then moral values start to change. They start to endorse more local forms of cooperation. And so I think maybe there's a quite interesting perspective there that says that tells us, like, first of all, these things are pretty malleable, and they're not unidirectional. Like, these things can go in either direction.
Oliver, I mean, if this discussion doesn't challenge at least sort of your origin idea about morality, i.e. that word really just describes cooperation and cooperative behaviors that human beings have, it's certainly begun to stretch the idea that your idea of morality cooperation has, complete explanatory or power or even value. I mean, it doesn't take into account perhaps these questions of fairness, of community and so on that we're going to discuss.
Okay. But I was going to say, I think I'm probably in enough trouble already, but I don't really believe in the expanded circle idea. I think that's not a very good metaphor. I believe in the expanded moral pie chart, or exploding moral pie chart, in that there's different, like I say, there's different types of morality that work in different ways, and they can sort of expand and jut out, not always, but somewhat independently, in response to what? Well, in response to the different cooperative opportunities society presents. And one of the reasons why morality varies from place to place and over time, especially over time, is because the various cooperative opportunities have massively expanded over historical time. So, as someone said before, we're in a global world. What's one of the features of a global world? Well, global trade. So people are reciprocating all over the world. So inevitably, you come to not just interact with, but take into the account the interests of people all over the place in a way that you didn't do before. So I think morals vary over time because the cooperative potential changes over time, and there's no guarantee it will always. It sort of grows like a great big blob. I think it grows in sort of functional ways in different directions. But I think the other reason why morals change is because, as Hume said, humankind is an inventive species, and we can invent new cooperative rules and try them out. We can hypothesize, try to find new and better ways of getting along, and sometimes they work and they catch on, like the Enlightenment. Like let's stop venerating. Lots of traditional societies, it's all about venerating the hierarchy and who's up and who's down, and feudal systems and all that. The Enlightenment said, hang on, let's try something else. Let's act as if everyone was equal, see how we get on. And it's worked out, that conjecture's worked out fairly well. The interesting downside of that is that some conjectures, some attempts won't work. There's some philosophers who've argued that it's immoral to have kids. Some have argued that it's the moral thing to do is for humans, for the sake of the planet, to commit suicide. Some have argued that we ought to be moral to plants. There are some, I'm not going to conclude, sort of give a final judgment on those conjectures, but I would bet that most people, most of the time, those attempts won't pass the audition, and we won't come, unlike the Enlightenment or queuing or other cultural inventions, we won't all stop having kids, we won't all commit suicide, and we won't all venerate our random plants. And it's an empirical question.
Unless anyone's going to come back on that, is anyone going to come back on that to say something more about that?
Can I? Sorry, I know you want to move on to the questions.
No, I don't. If there's more to be said.
Okay. Just picking up what Oliver started by saying there. I mean, in going along with the expanding circle narrative, I'm not saying, and I don't think Nichola's saying, on the contrary, that the more the circle expands, the better, and that's it. I mean, it's right to stress this plurality. I absolutely agree with Oliver there. Right to stress the different kinds of loyalties that we have and the different kinds of moral claims that they make on us. And sometimes the right thing to do is to stick by your friends, even if other people suffer as a result. If you're feeding your family and someone says, but you could do much more good in the world by feeding your family a lot less and sharing out the money to as many people as possible, well, your obligations are to your family, and that's where your loyalties lie. One thing I wanted to add to that is that in the light of that, I think I'm reluctant to make the concept of cooperation do too much of the work. I mean, I prefer the notion of social instincts of various different kinds and the way in which ethics is rooted then. Cooperation is always a part of them, obviously, but it's important to recognize also that, you know, some of our most important loyalties aren't just examples of reciprocal cooperation. They're relationships that create our identity, our sense of who we are. Our loyalties to our family are, hopefully they involve cooperation. It's your turn to do the washing up and so on. But it would be odd to think of a family or a household as just a set of cooperating individuals. In a real sense, your family identity is part of who you are. Your relationship to your friends is part of who you are. Again, friendship, of course, involves cooperation. It's your turn to buy the drink tonight. But there's a lot more to friendship and the loyalties that go with friendship than just helping one another out in a reciprocal sort of way. Now, you know, I mean, one may want to expand the term cooperation, so that it becomes somewhat more of a technical term, and perhaps Oliver would see his work as doing that. That's fine. But it's important to recognize, I think, that these identity conferring relationships are an important part of it. And that insofar as we're seeing them as part of cooperation, we're using the word in a wider sense. I can see Oliver nodding. That's great.
There's a question about who we approve of, who we think how we say that some people's actions are praiseworthy or blameworthy. And I'm afraid it takes as its departure point the question of cooperation again. But the question is, if cooperation is the essence of ethics, but let's leave that, it doesn't necessarily have to be about that if you don't want it to be. Let's talk about just the substance of the question. Why do we approve of, for example, whistleblowers, individualists who stand up against the pressures of groupthink and refuse to cooperate with others? But there are other questions here too that touch on this question of why we admire certain behaviours or blame other behaviours that aren't about cooperation, and some questions asking about, you know, why we think that certain things are fair outside of the question of cooperation, or why we think that why we have concepts like dignity in our ethical and moral thinking. Any responses on that? I mean, it seems that in a way these are some of the other ideas that Richard is talking about. There are other elements to our ethics than the ones that we've been talking about. And what are they? And how would you describe them? What would you give? What importance? Which ones would you give great importance to? Oliver.
Let me just offer a clarificatory comment which might speak to some of this. So often people think of cooperation as synonymous with cooperation in a social dilemma, like as synonymous with reciprocity, and obviously that's a very important part of our morality. But I'm using cooperation to refer to the technical concept of a non-zero sum game, some mutually beneficial interaction, of which there are many types that are not prisoner's dilemmas, that are not reciprocity. So put it this way: even if you were to completely annihilate reciprocity, there's no such thing as the prisoner's dilemma, no such thing as tit for tat, it never exists, it doesn't exist in the world, you would still have all the other moral values. You'd still have love and loyalty and heroism and deference and fairness, which is in a bargaining game, and property rights. So it's oranges are not the only fruit, and reciprocity is not the only type of cooperation. It encompasses many of the other things that have been discussed. And that's not me saying that, that's game theorists.
Oh, well. Nichola.
No, I totally agree with Oliver on that, actually. Like the cooperation I would view as being a really expansive concept that includes many kinds of interactions, and not only reciprocal. That's sort of one kind that, yeah, like Ollie said, is important, but it isn't the only kind of interaction that's cooperative. I think the question about whistleblowers is quite interesting. So quite a big strand of my research is on punishment, and whistleblowing is obviously a form of punishment, or it's one kind of punishment, let's say. And it's actually really interesting that, so punishment is, if you want to have like a sort of technical definition, which is the one that we would use when we're studying it, punishment is an act that involves you paying a personal cost to levy a reciprocal cost on someone who has cheated or someone who's done something bad. And often punishment is seen as something which you could say is a morally good thing. And I think this is where the question about whistleblowers came from, because people who accept those costs to punish others maybe help to promote some kind of group level cooperation by doing so. They help to call out these bad actors, and they help to, encourage collective action. But what's really interesting, actually, is that when we look at how people perceive people who punish others, like what are your perceptions of people who are willing to go out of their way to punish cheats in social interactions, people are not really that unified on whether they think this is good or bad. And, if you just go to the Edward Snowden page on Wikipedia, it's also quite apparent that, like, for some people he's a hero, and for other people he's a traitor, he's like an anti-patriot and things like this. So I think that it's actually really, we really don't agree on whether we view punishment as being a morally virtuous thing to do. And in part that's because punishment is by definition a harmful act, and so it could stem from harmful motives. Like you could punish people just because you're the kind of person who likes harming other people, and not because you're really concerned with the common good at all. And I think lots of what feeds into our moral judgments of whether it's punishment behavior or helping behavior that I mentioned before is us trying to look under the hood of what's actually motivating people to do these things. And if we suspect that those things are motivated by self-interest, so by either your competitive desire, your desire to harm people, in the domain of helping people, whether it's motivated by you wanting to look good or be virtue signaling or something like that, we often don't bestow moral praise on those individuals. And in fact, we view that as being immoral a lot of the time. So I think that people don't always view whistleblowers as good, definitely, but they also don't always view cooperators as good, like I said before. And lots of it is to do with this extremely sophisticated cognition we have that allows us to actually open up, look inside each other's minds, as it were, and try and figure out, like, why are you doing the thing you're doing? And if I think you're doing it because you're self-interested, I won't view that as being morally praiseworthy.
So is that the case then, that people are more likely to judge a person's actions based on their what they know about the intention of that person rather than the consequences of their actions? That's sort of something that your research has uncovered.
It's not more likely, but it feeds into it. And I think there's just a hot mess of stuff going on in our brains when we're trying to work out, like, how should I react to this thing? Where should I place this? Like, how do I categorize this thing? Is this good? Is this bad? Do I think this person deserves praise or not? Like, we lots and lots of things feed into that judgment, that kind of moral judgment. And we do it really intuitively. Like, it's quite easy to judge people, to judge outcomes, scenarios, people, and to come to a moral judgment of whether we think this thing is good or bad. But the interesting thing is we all come to different moral judgments. So I think there is something really important about, first of all, the context and also our individual perspectives on things that informs, like, what we perceive to be moral and immoral.
Richard, your own work on moral philosophy has made use of this similar idea that when we're thinking about what the right thing to do, or when we're judging others, that sort of complex of things going on. You're thinking about what's the consequence, but you're also thinking about what sort of person is this person, what sort of person do I want to be, and there's lots of factors going on all at the same time. Is that an important part of this for you?
Well, I think so, yes. I mean, Nicholas rightly stressed the context specificity of a lot of these kinds of cases, and the complexity. And I think that's right. And I think that follows from what she was saying about the whistleblower case. There are different kinds of whistleblowing, partly different kinds of intentions, but also different moral characters that it can have. Sometimes it might go along with the notion of punishment, she's right, which might or might not be a vindictive motivation. I would have thought often whistleblowing would tend to be motivated by a concern for honesty, wouldn't it? I mean, if people blow the whistle on garden parties in a garden of number 10, part of what drives them, I would have thought, is there are people being dishonest here and getting away with it, and this needs to be known. And I think the notion in that kind of context, the notion of honesty goes with ideas of integrity, and bringing in concepts like honesty and integrity and so on picks up what you were just saying about how an important dimension of moral thinking and moral awareness is thinking about the kinds of people that they are, thinking about what in the philosophical tradition is called virtue theory, the virtues and so on. That's an important dimension of it. So it's not just different intentions that people might have, but the kinds of qualities that they exhibit when they act. It's all part of complexity, you're right.
Nichola, the differences between individuals, I'll come to you in a second, Oliver, but unless you want to say something directly on that, because I'm going to slightly change the subject. No, okay. You were saying there, Nichola, about the different opinions that people have, the different judgments that different people make about it, and the individual approaches that the different conclusions they might come to when judging an act, someone else's act. And you mentioned just before we came into this event on Reddit, the "Am I the asshole" thread, and I thought that was a good way of illustrating this. Do you want to tell us something about that?
Yeah, so this is actually, we're doing a little piece of research using this Reddit. So Reddit is a social media platform for people who don't know what it is. And it's people tend to write long form posts on there. So it's a bit longer than Twitter. They tend to write longer posts. And there are lots of different forums on Reddit, and they're all called subreddits. And one of these subreddits is called "Am I the Asshole?" And essentially on this forum, people will post a vignette or a scenario of interpersonal conflict that they were involved in, non-violent interpersonal conflict, I should say. So it can range from, there are just so many weird and wonderful things on these things, from things like, am I the asshole for flushing my mother-in-law's soup down the toilet? Am I the asshole for ruining my sister's wedding? Like, there are all these different kinds of things where people have a scenario where they were in a situation of conflict and they don't know whether they're the asshole or not. So they ask the internet to judge whether they're the asshole, and people will make these judgments. They'll read this vignette and they will give one of four judgments: either yes, you're the asshole, no, you're not, or no one's an asshole here, or everyone's an asshole. So basically there are four kind of outcomes that can arise in these scenarios. And I think that the existence of this platform is interesting for a few reasons. So one, it's very, very entertaining, and it shows us just how subjectively rewarding it is to make moral judgments, and also how easy it is to do it. So we read these vignettes, they're all different, they're in weird and wonderful scenarios, things you could never dream up, but you come to a moral judgment about the scenario very easily. And so it's intuitive, even in these highly specific scenarios, to come to a moral judgment. So I think that's interesting. But I also think what's interesting is that even though it's very easy as a reader to come to these moral judgments, clearly there is some ambiguity here over what's moral and what's not moral, because people are asking the internet whether what they did was right or not. So there's clearly some scope for variation in moral judgment, to the extent that people are so unsure about whether they are acting morally or not that they are resorting to asking strangers on the internet to judge them for this thing. And we find that people do. So this research that we're doing using this forum shows that actually people's judgments are really quite varied. So one person might read the thing and say, yes, you're the asshole, but somebody else might read it and say, no, actually, I don't think you are the asshole here. And figuring out what we can, what attributes that people have that predict the different judgments that they make in those situations is something that we're starting to tap into now. So whether, for example, people who are more socially or economically conservative tend to make asshole judgments in certain scenarios more than others. For example, scenarios involving conflict in the family, which should be very important to people who fall further along the socially conservative spectrum, and things like this. Like, we can start to unpack, like, what is it about the different ways that people judge these moral scenarios that helps us to predict how people fall on these moral judgments. And so we're just starting to make headway into those kinds of questions now, and also to learn about what are the features where everybody agrees. So things like, if you do something harmful and it was intentional, everyone agrees that's bad. If it was foreseeable, pretty much everyone agrees that's bad. So there are some things where we all agree, and then there are other things where we differ. And I think that these kinds of data sets are going to be really, really important for us to getting really to grips with the richness of moral judgment in human societies, actually.
Oliver, how are you accounting for these sorts of variations in people's judgments, not just on that Reddit thread, but in general? How does what you've told us of your work treat these considerable differences? You've sketched out the similarities and accounted for them, and given an account of them and described them across societies. But what do you have to say about the differences?
Well, so, I mean, on the one hand, like as Nichola was saying, this people are playing like 7-dimensional social chess here. They're trying to take into account all these different factors. And when you're playing a game like that, trying to figure out what the right move is very difficult. Now, it's sometimes very difficult. Sometimes it isn't. If it's, I helped an old lady across the road, did I do the right thing? That doesn't appear on the Reddit channel because it's very straightforward. But you would predict that there will be situations where the trade-offs you're having to make are so close, you're sort of indifferent between the outcomes, that you can't call it. You can't make a determination as to which is the more cooperative move to make. So it's kind of what you would expect if morality is about negotiating between all these different competing rules. And it's interesting. I haven't really heard this argument before, but this idea about unlike science, morality has all these disagreements, therefore it's somehow special. I mean, science is full of disagreements too. People disagree about all kinds of things, and that's just what you expect when people can't agree on does coffee give you cancer or does it not. There is a fact of the matter somewhere, but the fact that we don't know at the moment and we keep doing more research to try and find out that's just the nature of life, and morality is no different in that respect.
Well, this is all part of that ongoing endeavour, that dynamic ongoing conversation that human beings have with themselves about what is the right thing to do, what might be the right thing to do. And you've been advancing it this evening, and so have all of you who've joined us in the audience. I know that Richard, Nichola and Oliver have stimulated you enormously. I'm sure that we'll be seeing them all again, and every one of their contributions has in a different way reflected a humanist perspective, which is obviously what Humanists UK is here to advance. I think we're hoping to do more interviews with them at different points. So your questions that we haven't reached in the Q&A box will not be wasted. They're being culled by our staff even as we speak, and we'll be putting them to the speakers for resources that will, beyond the event this evening, live forever. But that is the end of our event this evening. Just a final thank you, a warm and very genuine thank you to Nichola, Oliver and Richard for their contributions, which have been so insightful, so interesting, so stimulating. And thanks to them, thanks to you for sacrificing a less pleasant than it was when we started, outside at least, evening. See you next time.